Hello everyone, my name is Yiran, and the topic I'll present for today is Accessible System and End-User Elicitation. The title of the paper I chose is An Empirical Investigation of User Requirements Elicitation, comparing the effectiveness of prompting techniques. First of all, what is user requirement elicitation? It refers to the process of researching and discovering system requirements from users through elicitation process such as interviews. Successfully collecting accurate information from users will increase the chance of developing a good system. However, as the author suggested, little research has measured the effectiveness of requirement elicitation techniques. That's the motivation of this paper, and I'll show you the comparison between different types of requirement elicitation techniques in the following slides. Here's the overview of my presentation content. I'll first introduce the difficulties analysts are facing during requirement elicitation, and then how they come up with a prompting technique in order to solve those issues. Then I'll show you more techniques and how the author designed the experiment for comparing those. And finally, we'll go through the result and conclusion. For a variety of cognitive, communicative, and motivational reasons, the information ultimately received and understood by analysts is generally incomplete. Here, the author identifies 3 types of issues that are causing the problem, but we will only focus on the cognitive one for this paper. It means as human, our brain always has constraints when processing information. For example, we can only focus on a limited amount of information, or sometimes we may have cognitive biases. So, in order to overcome the cognitive problems, the author developed a new technique called task characteristic technique based on previous knowledge. The question asked by this technique have two types of prompt, which are substantive prompt and procedure prompt. Substantive prompt should simulate users' memory structure in ways that improve recall of knowledge relevant to system requirement, while procedure prompt focuses on reasoning strategies people use, and therefore should result in a more complete set of requirements. Here are some example questions. Let's see the blue boxes first, which is substantive prompts. You can see that both of them are asking similar questions but in different ways, which helps user to improve the recall of knowledges. Red boxes are procedure prompts, which use different questioning approach, including counterargument, asking for summarization, and also scenario building. This will help users to reduce judgmental bias and overcome the limitation of short-term memory. In order to test the effectiveness of new prompting technique, we now have 2 more as control group and treatment group. The control group is called interrogatory technique, also known as syntactic technique. All the questions asked by this prompt start with who, what, when, where, why, and how. And the treatment group is a semantic technique, and all questions asked by this technique are classified into corresponding categories. These are tables including typical questions asked by syntactic and semantic prompting techniques. You can see that syntactic questions are all started with who, what, when, where, why, and how, and those questions are also very generalized. And semantic technique divide all questions into 5 categories, which are goals, agents, actions, events, and states or conditions. To better examine the experiment result, we need to have a generic requirement category as our coding scheme to organize information. Generic requirement category is context independent, which means it doesn't rely on specific system but can be generalized across different ones. Because of that, this type of scheme has great potential value, since it eliminates the need to create different categories to evaluate the requirement for each new information system application. Here in this paper, it categorized all requirements into 4 general levels, which are goals, process, text, and information. Here I'll show you the detail of the experiment to compare different techniques I mentioned earlier. The experiment utilized a short case describing a grocery company interested in developing an internet-based food shopping system. And there are 3 testing groups. One tested with the task characteristic technique, one with syntactic technique, and one with the semantic technique. The interviewer participated one-on-one with subjects in a lab setting, and in order to reduce bias, the interviewer was blind to the hypothesis of the study. Once all requirements are gathered from user, researchers coded their response according to the generic requirement category and then start the measurement. The measurement that the researchers were interested in were the quantity of requirements and the quantitative difference in information elicited by the 3 prompting techniques. Here are the findings of the experiment. Firstly, the researchers found out that the time spent on tasks by members of the 3 groups was not significantly different, indicating that any differences between groups were not a result of the amount of time spent considering the problem. The quantitative result is shown on next slide. Here you can see, except requirement for goal level for each subject, the total number of requirements and all other 3 level types elicited by task characteristic techniques are all higher than the other 2 approach. This leads to the conclusion that the total number of requirements per subject elicited by the task characteristic prompting technique is higher than the number elicited by either the semantic technique or the syntactic technique. Also, the total number of process level, task level, and information level requirements per subject by new prompting technique are also higher than the other 2. Next, let's look at the breadth of the information elicited. Breadth is calculated by counting the total number of different techniques categories mentioned by subjects, which is important because it shows how well a technique elicits a range of information from subject. According to the data cited from the paper, the researchers conclude that there is no advantage for any of the groups in the breadth of information elicited. One alternative explanation for this is the precision of the coding scheme. For instance, if each level of coding scheme contains too few categories for requirements, this limitation may result in an insufficiency to measure the breadth. Regarding the difference in category usage, the researchers found that there were no significant quantitative difference in the types of requirement elicited by each technique. Consequently, the use of more than one technique is not likely to cause users to evoke requirements from different categories. In summary, this paper discussed the difficulties in requirement elicitation and why we should solve the cognitive issue as one type of difficulties. Then the paper went through a new prompting technique called task characteristic technique, which utilized both substantive prompts and procedure prompts. In order to test the effectiveness of this, 2 other prompting techniques, syntactic and semantic technique, are used as control and treatment group. And finally, the author concludes the result from the research that task characteristic technique is effective when eliciting requirements for some specific category, but there is no advantage for it in the breadth of information elicited. They also conclude that there were no significant quantitative differences in the types of requirements elicited by each technique, which further suggests that there is no need to use more than one technique during user requirement elicitation process. That's all. Thanks.